Well, hello again, and welcome back to Truth and Wholeness. I'm Dr. Albert LaChance. If you haven't seen the first one, this is the second one, second presentation we'll be doing as I try to convince you to give me the gift of your trust in my truth so that I can reach you where I really want to reach you, which is by way of a warning. Yes, by way of a warning, but also to provide you with an alternative vision. It's not just saying this is bad and that's bad and this is bad, though there's a lot of bad going on, but there is, in fact, a model for how to get out of here, how to get out of this mess. And protect ourselves, our children, our grandchildren, our great grandchildren, and all the animals that we all love. And there is a way. And I would ask you this question. Have you ever wondered what it would be like if you had an answer to the world's woes and no one would listen? And that's the question I want to begin this one with. I want to pose that to you because I live in that world. I live both in the world that is decaying as I look at it, but also after 50 years of study, prayer, meditation, doing whatever I can do to gather my understanding, I actually have come to an answer that I suspect will not be welcome in any way close to universality. I don't, I'm not a fool, but there's an answer, and I gave you two of the uh, ingredients of that answer in the first talk, and so I'm going to kind of bring those two out again in order to catch us up with number two here. And one is we've got to sober up. We have to sober up, and there's a very real reason why we have to sober up. It is because, in my own experience, as well as in my doctoral studies, I've come to understand that the neurology of the brain becomes an impediment to the awakening of the soul when the brain is altered by the introduction of chemistries of whatever kind. And that doesn't mean I'm some kind of fundamentalist that I have blood pressure medication myself, but that's not what I mean. I mean things that are taken, ingested for the sake of being high. And the other piece is to be able to provide you with a working model of what evolution actually is. And this great teacher that I mentioned, Father Thomas Berry, but his teacher, even before him, talked about evolution as the pressure of the Holy Spirit in matter, so that everything ultimately that emerged from that fireball, from the emergence of the galaxies, emergence of the stars, emergence of the earth, and the life formation, the kind of Darwinian understanding of the evolution of life. From all of that, there is an undercurrent, a pressure that is present and mentioned in every spiritual tradition on earth, and now has emerged in science through quantum mechanics. The notion of oneness, the notion that we're not strangers to each other, even though introverts like myself would like to be very frequently stranger on the earth. I enjoy my solitude. But the fact is, in every tradition, be it Middle Eastern, which would be, of course, well, people would normally say it's Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Well, it isn't. It isn't. It's Abraham and Melchizedek, and then the Hebrew tradition, out of which emerges Christianity. Christ was not a Christian, Christ was a Jew, and then the Prophet Muhammad and what grew up around them. Elsewhere, we have the Chinese development, which would be largely Taoism and Confucianism, which see that oneness, that one pressure, as the Tao, the way that life expresses itself through what in the Tao Te Ching is called the myriad creatures. And in India, of course, there the primordial traditions, and then out of them Hinduism, and out of Hinduism Buddhism and Jainism, and all the other derivatives on the Indian continent. And last, but most, certainly not least, the native peoples on every continent, everywhere on earth. This primordial understanding of the relational truth between human culture and the planet, the native peoples. And I've said this before, I've spoken nationally, and in every place, as long as I can remember to do it, like it just came to me now, when when the Europeans came to this continent, the peoples who were receiving them um, did not have. I mean, they saw Whitey as God. That this, in fact, it fulfilled some of their prophecies. What was possible there was the great wedding, I call it, the great wedding between patrifocal Europe and matrifocal America. And what we got was the great rape. And then, doubling down on that, we started stealing people from Africa and selling them for profit here too. And we're still using them for profit. We're still not, things are getting better in terms of, talking about it. We talk about the native peoples. Obama certainly tried to defend them. And of course, Obama also tried to defend the black population. He was part of it. But overall, we've done a pretty sad job. Whitey, I am French. I supposedly have a Mima, which is often pronounced Micmac, uh, female Indian in my heritage. And I suspect it's true because back when I was told, it would have been something they were kind of embarrassed about, you know. My wife, Carol, is a Brit. In fact, I'm picking her up at the airport right down the street from the church I'm speaking in this afternoon, today. And between the French and the English alone, let alone the Spanish, just between our ancestors, the damage that has been done to the soil, to the rivers, to the habitat, and to these people, and it's still going on at the southern border. The people that we're excluding down there are really just returning to their land. They're just returning to their land. Why would we call an area New Mexico if it wasn't a New Mexico? This is New Hampshire. It's a New Hampshire. So what I'm trying to say is that I and Thomas Berry, even more so than Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, You hear the Frenchman in me there. Um, we have really taken the time to look at all the other traditions. I remember one time when after a number of years, and I could speak, kind of man to man with Thomas Berry. He'd come down out of the celestial spheres in my imagining and became like the rest of us. And I asked him, I said, "How old are you, Father Thomas?" And he said, "I'm 76 years old." And I said, "How long have you been studying?" And he said, "About 77 years." And that's the kind of scholarship that this guy put together. Well, I've been at it 50 myself, 50 of the serious years. I'm not talking about college. I was, just hippie, I guess. Probably the best wastebasket to throw me into at that point. But shortly after that, in the 70s, I became serious and sober. Two very important words. Excuse me. So, I've asked you that question about, have you ever thought about what it would be like to actually have, or believe you have at least, an answer to the multiform mess that we're in? Well, I am that guy. And I realize how, even by saying this to a global audience, or a potential global audience at least, that I'm taking the risk of really making a fool of myself. Um, and fools are typically what the prophetic voice is. It's the speech of fools who possess the truth. And as it says in the Gospels, they get the prophet's reward, which is not always fun. So I am that guy, and I'm asking you, do you even want to listen? Because you have the power to turn this right off or never even come onto it, right? But if you sense something in me that really is imploring you, that really is crying out to you from the one spirit that is made manifest in all those traditions, India, China, Middle East, the native peoples, the United States, the spirit in Canada and Mexico, everywhere, everybody comes to the same conclusion that it's all one system. And that one system, while visible in its material manifestation, is invisible in its spiritual manifestation. So that the movement of my soul to your souls is that invisibility. You've never seen me, I've never seen you. But what we forget is that I've never seen me either, and you've never seen you. In my case, there's this aging primate here who is 72 years old. Teilhard died at 73. Thomas Berry lived to be like 94. Uh, and I hope I get at least half of that difference. I wish they split the difference between them so I can get the work done that I'm trying to do. But most of the universe is invisible. And materialism is a huge mistake because it's all what is visible. We have to come to understand that it is predominantly, I'm talking like 99.999% invisible. And that is the source of the oneness and the understanding that has emerged in all of the cultures globally. That is what I want to talk to you about. is that we have this sense of um, some kind of an advantage in being able to see the structures of the cosmos unfolding. But the fact is, what's really going on is that they're manifested by an invisible oneness that we all participate in, and that the other primates and the other mammals, the basal mammals, the reptiles, all the way back to that first light, all participate in it. And I remember at one point watching, I was watching television, and it was during one of the most recent elections, and there were a number of politicians, part of one of the parties, and they were being asked, "How many of you believe that evolution's a reality?" And none of them would own to it. And they all know that it is. These are bright people. They didn't get to where they were by being opaque. They're bright people. But they are condescending to us rather than teaching us. They're laughing at us rather than teaching us. They know what they're trying to do. They're literally depending on what they see as our ignorance. But we're not ignorant. Some of us might not know, and some of us might hide from knowing. It's right in ignore, ignore ants, right? It's a form of agnosis, which means no knowledge. It's a purposeful, the poet T.S. Eliot calls it a deliberate habitude, useless in the darkness into which they peered, or from which they turn their eyes. So, that invisible dimension of us right now is, whether we know it or not, feeling the pain of the desecration of the life community, the life systems of the planet, the overall planet itself. We feel that right about here in what the East calls the fourth chakra. Many of us think and run off to other PhDs and MDs to become medicated because they think that this is an individual pain, but it isn't. It's collective. It's based on the diminution of life itself, which we're part of. So what do they do with that? They go through alcohol, weed, opioids, opiates, all of the various different escapes on the menu in order to try not to feel that feeling, which is coming from where they actually are themselves. So Thomas Berry called that a massive cultural pathology. In other words, it's not individual. It's a collective phenomenon that we try to drink down, drug down, eat down, sex down, gamble down, whatever it might be, to try to deny the fact that we're all in pain. And even as I talk about it, I start feeling it again because it's there all the time. And what are some of the, if we were to make a list, I've done some different diagnoses than what appears in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychology Association. By the way, I'm not against them either. They're doing a great deal of good. They're giving people comfort. Some of them wake up and are able to be present to their people rather than just writing on a prescription pad. I had a prescription pad that had nobody's name on it, and I gave some of my clients, I would prescribe several um, half-hour shows from Mr. Rogers in order to deal with their pain. So I tell them, here's my prescription. You got to watch Daniel's Tiger, Daniel the Tiger, or you're going to watch this or that, because Fred Rogers was an enlightened Christian mystic, and his approach to doing something about his ministry was through the television to kids who through no fault of their own, experienced, uh, violence in the family, broken families, and always blaming themselves. And so Fred Rogers is much laughed at, but the fact was he was an enlightened Christian mystic. So overall, what are the symptoms? What I call a um, consciousness deprivation disorder, CDD. And it's where people leave behind the very sources of wisdom that would cause them to grow in a certain way, think in a certain way. And I'm not talking about brainwashing, I'm talking about the wisdom that enables them to come out of their ignorance and to have what's needed in order to make proper judgments about how to live, how to love, how to parent, how to be a political, to make good political choices, and so on and so forth. Have a have a career that heals rather than devastates the natural order. Consciousness deprivation disorder. Here are some of the symptoms. Number one, be no surprise to you, the loss of spiritual values. I mean, how is it that wherever we know something about the human, the first things we know are what they believed in and in a power greater than themselves? In the caves at Lascaux and Altamira and many other places, we have these early drawings. These were early cathedrals, these caves. And we have these early drawings of their interaction, the paintings of their interaction with the animal world and with the larger truth of life itself. So, as a result of the loss of spiritual values, we really are confused with regards to the people that we elect in this unbelievably great nation, this experiment in truth called the United States of America, this opportunity for people to gather together in freedom and make decisions about the quality of the people who will rule over them, in a sense, or implement those invisible laws. I talked about the universe as invisible. Law is invisible. We see the manifestation of law in the way people live, but the law itself is not visible. It appears in language, but its manifestation is for those who assent to being brought down certain alleyways toward truth. It's an assent to go along and to support. And boy, look at who is being elected by that same miraculous system that's encoded in the United States Constitution. And look what we did right from the get-go. We compromised with truth immediately, right from the get-go. So then we wind up with people in office who distort the laws for their own personal gain or out of outright cruelty. There are sociopaths presently occupying very high positions who enjoy the pain they inflict. That is what sociopathy is. It's the absolute indifference. It's the Mengele, the Joseph Mengele of the world. The hyper-frenetic culture due to digital addictions. Because what's really happened is I saw the guy who invented the Intel chip appear on television, and he said he was appearing on television as a public service to warn people to really control the Intel chip, because digital addiction was a real thing, because it trains the brain to be always dependent on flashing light. And he was warning and saying he doesn't let his kids have cell phones. It's the guy that invented it. The loss of supportive species. I've already, in the first session, I told you that the UN, not the churches, and by God, it is a moral issue before it's political or anything else. It's a moral issue, the way we're living, that could take down 1 million species, and that they could say that with authority, and that the planet would be catastrophic within 12 years. The collapse of the family, our inability to tolerate each other long enough to at least give our children to the world with some kind of gain, because evolution always is fructified in the next generations, made fruitful in the next generations. The universe seemingly cannot prevent the growth of its own parts unless the self-reflexive animal, us, chooses to ignore them. There's an underlying fear involved in everything, an underlying fear, and it's part of that fourth chakra, nausea, this vague kind of fear all the time, and it leads to addictions, because momentarily, you roll a joint, you pop a beer, you drop an oxy or whatever. For a moment, that fear is allayed, but it comes back even more ferociously as soon as the chemistry wears off. And there's an underlying fear also of wars, many of which seem to be without value. No one could argue that World War II shouldn't have happened. In the face of fascism, I'll tell you a very brief story. I was sitting with 3 buddies one time in my house, and we were talking about Hitler and fascism and all this other stuff. One was a black African from Ghana. His father was a chieftain in Africa, but he was educated in the Methodist schools there, and he was a doctor of the great ideas, is what his degree was called, from the University of New Mexico. Another one, well, 2 of them were Jews, and one of them was what's called a Buju, a Buddhist Jew. He's a master. He's a spiritual master in the Eastern traditions, and the other guy was studying Jewish mysticism at Harvard. And I'm sitting there with my 3 buddies, all of whom I respect and really love and honor. And we're talking about Hitler. And they get onto this track where, well, Hitler could have been negotiated with, right? And we get into this argument, and I'm talking to them, and I'm thinking to myself, from the Nazi point of view, I'm the only human being here in this room. Blacks aren't human. Jews, we know what happened to them. What am I arguing about here? So I stopped arguing and I told them, you can't argue with somebody who doesn't see you as validly human. You can't, there's no negotiating with that. World War II had to happen. But what's ironic is that if we're to follow down the level of thinking that Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State, Marilyn Albright, in her book called Fascism, A Warning, and we're watching the rise of it right here. The very nation that squashed fascism like a bug is now watching it pop back up in our midst. And I think she's correct. I wrote to her to that effect. She sent me her book. Well, she sent me a sticker for the inside of her book. I had bought the book, We had a little interaction as a result. Nuclearism is part of that fear base. We know, even though we like to repress it to the unconscious, we know that at any moment, the guy in North Korea, the guy in the White House, they keep probing each other like two bullies in the schoolyard. Oh yeah? Well, how about this? How about we know this is going on, and we know that there are serious mental issues in both cases. Just yesterday, um, I heard on the news that Kim Jong Un, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, I don't care if I don't, um, has the people who were negotiating with the United States in North Korea to try to come to a nuclear agreement, because they failed, faced a firing squad. They're all shot. I mean, that's fascism. I don't care if it happens to be, under the flag of Stalin, way off to the left. That's what fascism is. It's hatred creating policy. It's it's the creation of policies grounded on hatred. So you might have over on the left here, Stalin, and over on the right, Hitler, but these are the same guy. These are the same guy, and we know what's going on around us, unless we're willfully blind. Also, the destruction of the life systems. I mean, right here in New Hampshire, right now, there's this big thing going on about PET plastic. I forget it's PET something or other. And we find out that once again, the groundwater is poisoned. And 80% of New Hampshire citizens drink right from wells. And who knows what's going on down there. So there's all that fear of the very source of life itself, water. There's the greed and corruption and justice. At this point, it seems to pervade all three branches of government. I don't know how we work our way out of here unless we pray for some kind of political messiah. Overall meaninglessness. Why do people kill themselves? Why is there such an incredible rise in suicide beyond the deaths from drugs, from overdose? Well, meaninglessness. Unless a person has a code on the inside that brings them to something meaningful and makes their life an expression of that meaning, there gets to be a place where there's no reason to go on. Why go on? Why do anything? If we're that battered, our wholeness is broken and the truth does not rise. Disgust and absurdity are the results. The notion that it's all absurd anyway, what difference does it make? Well, I was faced with that when in the conversation I told you about with Thomas Berry, when he said, no, it's all going to devolve. And I just decided, well, what's the point in not doing it at that point? If things are that critically intense, then it is high time to respond, and that's what I chose to do. I decided that when my children asked me what I did when the whole thing was coming down, that I'd have a good long resume to say this is what I did. And and I'm doing it right now. I'm doing it at this moment. And I'm doing it for the same reason I did it for them, for love of life, and for the real deep belief that there is a way to love from the soul that is more profound than any of the other ways to love, romance, or any of the other ways. That this love of each other just because we exist and to try to speak for each other. So each culture, now if there's a beginning of an answer, I've talked to you about the different cultures of the world. They have in common one thing, and that is oneness. They all come to it. If we just stop listening to well-meaning idiots and start just letting everybody get to where their traditions are supposed to bring them, okay, we don't do the same rituals, we don't have the same beliefs, we don't have the same name, but God is not the name of God in any tradition. It's a so God as we understand God, which emerges from the greatness of Alcoholics Anonymous, of all places, the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. And boy, Alcoholics Anonymous, including me, was at least at some point the last. So each culture, and this is the beginning of mixing the answer with the problem, each culture must be returning to its moorings, its initial suppositions, and recreate personal, ecological, religious morality. And in the very first pages of Alcoholics Anonymous, they talk about creating a moral psychology. Well, that's why I call myself now um, a psychologian, because it admixes both the theological and the psychological. Psyche is soul, it's sacred. It is not about manipulating the brain to make it forget. It's about opening the soul so we have the source from which to remember. Remember, put the pieces back together again. Remember. So I'm going to close this one with a little suggestion that I think would help us in some small and somewhat silly way, is that we change the spelling of the word wonder and instead have it be Oneder, wonder, to be amazed again, to be open again, to be enthralled with the beauty of the planet again, and leave this place when it's time to enter the invisible again, and from there instruct. That song from um, oh God, I can't think of their name right now, but teach your children well. Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Teach your children well. Well, I have tried to teach my children well. I don't know how successful I've been, but I've tried. And so anyway, with that, this is the end of talk number 2. I ask for the blessing of all of you, and that you receive this from one who won't pretend in the I love you way, but to let you know that I certainly love you in the way that comes from the soul and not necessarily from the heart.